Well, welcome everyone. If this is your first time joining, I'm Nicole McLean, Head of Marketing here at Composely. Really excited to be wrapping up our journey this May with two of my absolute favorite people, Rachel Downey, founder and CEO of Share Your Genius, and Jonathan Gandalf, founder and CEO of The Juice. I have been able to personally work with them as coworkers, partners, vendors, kind of everything, and they are going to have some really incredible things to share. Some housekeeping, everyone is on auto mute, so please use the chat, please use the Q&A. I will be keeping an eye on both throughout our conversation. And then we are recording today's webinar, so please don't feel like you have to take copious notes. We will send a recording of this for you all tomorrow. But with that, Rachel and Jonathan, welcome, and thanks so much for helping us close out the series.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Ditto. Excited to be here.
I also knew I wanted to have both of you on as we did a bit of a racing theme, which of course was inspired by the Indy 500. All of us are Indianapolis natives, I think, all living here. So I'm pretty sure that Jonathan's stash is partly thanks to the Indy 500. But excited just to kind of wrap up with some Indianapolis friends for this conversation. So we've heard from some awesome folks talking about, everything from content operations to why the blog isn't dead in 2024, cross-functional collaboration and goal alignment. And today we really want to focus in on, you put all of this structure in place, you create all this great content, but then how do you make sure it's actually resonating with your audience and it's getting put in front of the right people? And so ultimately, that's really what we're focusing on. If you're not familiar with Share Your Genius or The Juice, Share Your Genius is not just a podcast agency because it's always more than a podcast, but really a great storytelling media agency. And then The Juice is a content distribution and curation platform for sales and marketers. So I knew that both of you would have some really interesting insights in working with clients and just, I think the distribution game has changed. Like we were just talking about that, before we hopped on and figuring out what is the new playbook that works. And so to kind of kick us off, I'm curious, Rachel, I'd love to start with, how you think about content distribution, and how does distribution and repurposing really go together?
Yeah. So I think when I think about distribution, I think that's where you start when it comes to creating content and making sure that what you're going to create is actually going to resonate. You have to start with almost the outcome in mind of where is this going? And who is it ultimately for? And the way that you choose where it's going is based on where your audience is, right? And where they're already engaging. And so that's why I always kind of get on a soapbox around best practices and things like that. And even playbooks, because it's the play only works for the players that you're trying to play with, So it's that. And I will say 99% of our clients are B2B. And so the channels we really focus on are LinkedIn, YouTube, and then obviously we're in the podcast space. So we're leveraging those podcasts. But I think you have to go distribution first before you can make the decisions around what content you're creating. Cute little friend there, around the content you're creating before you can even have the conversation around what are we then going to repurpose.
For sure. Well, and we were talking before, and Jonathan, you had some great insight, but is the entity, the content you want to create, is that where you start first as a content team? Or do you, figure out how you're going to repurpose from there? Or do you go in a different direction?
Yeah, I think Rachel's exactly right. You just got to go where the people are already at. And I think a great real life example of this for me is the last company I was at was a healthcare analytics platform. And we sold primarily to insurance agencies. And the idea of an benefits consultant, visiting a blog, pretty far-fetched. But if you take good content to an event where they love to meet in person, they love to network, they love to, schmooze a little bit, you could really resonate. Now, in the space that I'm in, everybody's on LinkedIn, everybody's in those digital channels that previous buyer wasn't. So if you came to this recording looking for the one strategy to end all strategies, this probably isn't going to be the right perspective, or we don't have all of those answers. But maybe to answer your question a little bit more specifically, Nicole, I'm a big believer because of some of that, because there is no one size fits all strategy, that what's really important beyond the content is a consistent point of view, right? So no matter how you're redistributing, repurposing, recreating, atomizing. I think it's more important the perspective and the point of view is consistent across that process, because at enterprise businesses, you're going to have one team, repurposing content into a podcast channel, one team taking it to an event, one team taking it to an ads channel. And all that's good. And I think you should do all of that. But I think it's critical that the point of view and the perspective is consistent through all those channels.
Yeah, absolutely. Rachel, I've worked with you and like created that content flywheel before, and so I've seen it play out. But how do you think an organization should think about that flywheel effect when trying to be on a lot of channels and meet people where they are, and knowing that like it's not just, okay, I have this 170 character social post, so I'm going to put it on LinkedIn and Twitter, now X, and Instagram, and like, cool, I repurposed, I'm done. Like, it has to be more than that, right?
Yeah. And I think the other thing I always think about is when people talk about content flywheels, the word scale always comes to mind. It's like, I want to scale my content. I want to scale my content. And I think when I think of the word scale, I think of broad audience, meaning like I'm going everywhere because I think that's what I'm supposed to do. And that's also where I would challenge our thinking. And I would be like, scale isn't always the right move. I think what you would rather try and do is go, what is the cornerstone content that we're creating that is like, that supports our content pillars, that supports that point of view in the marketplace? What's like the one thing we want to be known for? So if anyone says, what does the juice do? Everyone says the same thing over and over again. Who is it for? And everybody knows, you know what I mean? And so that's like the job of content from the marketing side. It's like, you have to create the content that creates that consistent message, which is what Jonathan was saying. And then you go, all right, like I don't need this to be everywhere. I just need it to be where my people are, which goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning. And so when I think about that content flywheel effect, it really comes down to what's the cornerstone content I'm creating that supports the content pillars that I need to get out into the marketplace. That's really where I think that content flywheel comes into effect when I think about that.
I think, unfortunately, to double down on that, I think a lot of times what works in content works inherently because it doesn't scale.
Yeah.
Because it is weird, because it's a pattern interrupt, because it's different, it's fun. Like, unfortunately, a lot of times what works in content just doesn't scale. I think you're right on the like flywheel. We did a trends report in the fall, and we are starting to do them quarterly. And it came around to do our spring trends report, and our fall trends report was still performing so well. We're like, we're not about to like dump another it felt like we'd be putting a blanket on that fire, right? And it's like, let's not do that. Like, let's just continue to run with this. Like, obviously the market's reacting to the message from that fall trends report, so let's just keep running with it. So I think flexibility and being nimble, no matter how you're distributing or repurposing, and understanding some of it just might not scale.
And the last thing I'll say on that too, it's like, there's also different applications of the word scale too, right? Like, this is the law school background I have, right? Where it's like, let's analyze the meaning. But I will say, like, one of the things that I think of a lot about is I'm like, to your point, it's like this one piece of content was so good, right? Like, we nailed it. People loved it. It tells our message. It tells our story. I need more people to read it, consume it, watch it, love it, etc. So that's where I start to go, how do I scale this piece? Not by repurposing and all that kind of stuff, but more like, who are my partners who can help me spread the word? Because that's still how we all buy today. Like, literally, it's how B2C buys, it's how B2B buys. Like, anybody who shows up in my inbox as pipeline, it's because somebody told them about us. It's not because I'm doing anything great on marketing. So that's the same thing that's happening today is my point. And so, really what I'm thinking about there is how do I get this thing out there? It's finding really good partners, whether that's influencers, whether it's great distribution channels, like, you get the idea there. So that's something also to really be thinking about when you're planning in your strategy.
So good.
Well, I think that human element is interesting as we've watched. And of course, this is very dependent on the human, like who is the human you're targeting. But in a lot of B2B post-COVID, I feel like there's been this almost like anti-virtual or like anti-digital, like email. Everyone's saying it's not performing as well. Some of this is the AI, but like even search on Google has just gone down. Like, I think people are thirsting for this in-person human connection after being forced to not have that for so long. And I think it's making marketers like rethink the distribution channels, and that, okay, if paid ads maybe aren't quite where I'm putting budget, like, I just saw a trend that influencer marketing and is driving up again. But if you don't have the right influencer that matches your perspective, like, that's going to feel inauthentic. Um, and so I'm curious, like, this is kind of off of our prep, but especially for a larger company, like, I think for SMBs, it's maybe a little easier to keep that human component of the brand. You can have founder led content or thought leadership, or you can find that like thought leader internally, or, you're sharing more. Like, it's just a little bit easier. But when you're this bigger corporation, how do you maybe keep that human element as you think about your distribution and connection with your target market?
I I was talking to one of our customers last week, and they were talking about their LinkedIn strategy, and I think it's similar to the influencer strategy, where it's very popular right now to empower personal brands versus people want to buy from people versus buying from companies or brands, right? So like everybody's trying to empower their employees to have a presence on LinkedIn. And like I've done it. I would suspect we've all done it, where like you send the copy and paste out to your entire team, and like maybe 50% of them do that exactly, copy and paste. And I think like there was a time when that worked, but I think like we all get it now, like we know when that's happened, right? And I think like what is it's so much like you look at that like LinkedIn strategy, or that personal brand strategy, and it's like a demand gen tactic. But I think like more important than that, you have to create a brand that your team and your network are excited about. Like I actually think it's a brand exercise. Like if your team and your customers and your prospects think your brand is cool, they're more likely to engage and amplify your message on LinkedIn, right? And it's such a like um nuanced thing. Like our sales leader, she doesn't post very often, but she's in the comments all the time. She's the lurker. And like, but she's built relationships that way, and like she's built yeah, like people know her from LinkedIn, but she's hardly ever posting. She's just very present in comments and things like that. So like it's such a like nuanced, like individual, like personal thing. And I think you have to be careful sometimes to not think that you own that personal brand for your employees, but rather just like build something they're proud of, and know that organically it'll happen from there.
Mm-hmm.
And for my, I always think to myself, like when we talk about sales and marketing and all this and everything that rolls up under sales and marketing, right? Brand, demand, content, et cetera. It still is a people's business. Like great marketers, great salespeople, et cetera, know people really well, and they know their people really well, and they know how to communicate typically really well. And so it's like, don't forget that this is like this is just this,
Yeah.
this is going to sound so like shitty and I'm going to get canceled, but like it's hard, but we make it really hard. Like it's not that hard. Like in the sense of like driving that connection, and we've overcomplicated it, unfortunately.
100%.
And it's like, if you think about this as like, I think about this all the time. I want to do fewer things better, because when I have fewer things, I can focus more on who I really want to talk to. So I think you're talking about Kate, Jonathan, but like the whole idea there of like her just going, and I'm making this up, but I'm going to just use it as an example. Her going, hey, I don't have a lot to say specifically, but I know that I'm a people person who needs to just connect with people. So I'm going to go engage with the content that my brand, the juice, wants to be associated with.
Exactly.
No brainer. You know what I mean? And then it goes back to this idea of this cornerstone content and like doing fewer things better. So like choosing, I'm going to do a webinar series. I'm going to choose to do an event series like this, or I'm going to do video, or I'm going to do a podcast, or whatever you're going to do it really well, and then empower your internal team, you know what I mean? And like allow them to also have the space to add their own personality to it and things like that. But if you start with something strong from a content like cornerstone perspective that's aligned with the company core values, et cetera, then you shouldn't have an issue of going, am I consistently getting our brand message out there in a way that's aligned with our brand mission goals, et cetera, et cetera. So that was kind of like a rant, but I think the thing that I would just encourage everyone to do is go, what are the fewer things I can do better that allow me to show up more like I would in my everyday life outside of my quote unquote 9 to 5?
And this is probably a whole like separate webinar, Nicole, but like the undercurrent to all of this is like you do need to be able to measure what's working and what's not
Yeah.
working. And I think like I'm shocked at how many marketers I talk to that aren't actually able to answer that question. And I think like that's just it probably needs to go unsaid to an enterprise audience, but sometimes I think we need to stop and slow down and do exactly what Rachel's saying, and like simplify, but you have to know what's working to be able to simplify to
Yeah.
the right thing.
And even that, Jonathan, like simplify of like, I would ask my CEO, what numbers do you actually care about?
Right.
Because most CEOs are not reading all the numbers and all the pulling all those reports that you're probably generating or spinning your wheels doing. I'd be like, what matters to you? You know what I mean? And then just focus like hell on that thing, you know, and that is the number one KPI that we need to be accountable to. And everybody knows, you know, there's dark social and all this kind of stuff, but like it really does come back down to like, what is the one thing we want to be known for? What is the one thing that we're measuring, or 3 things or 5 things that are measuring to know that we're known for that thing? And how do we get the people back in to the process?
For sure. Ellen, you kind of answered this at the jump, Rachel, of starting with your distribution. But if you put the human or like your target market at the center of what you're doing, I mean, it's a little bit of the chicken or the egg. It's like you want to make sure that they want to consume the content, but also if they can't find the content, like I think that's where a lot of marketers do fall in, is they spend all this time creating a great white paper or a great trends report. But then it's like, okay, well, like I know this piece of content's better than my competitors. It's better design, it has better perspective, but like now how do I make sure people see it? So like what is more important, to have like the channel first, or knowing where you're going to put it, or just making sure the content's really good? And eventually, if you're focused and you have like 3 things, eventually the people will come. Like how do you kind of think about that?
Well, I mean, it's Field of Dreams. If this is not Field of Dreams, right? Like if they build it, they will come or whatever. It's
Yeah.
not that. So people's attention, we're all getting distracted constantly, and our attention is our most valuable thing right now. And so I literally would be like, where is the attention going? What is the content we need to create to be on that channel where my people are already engaging and are already active? You need to create something that's worth paying attention to, but you have to know where you're going to distribute it first, because what I put on YouTube is different than what I put on Apple Podcasts. It's different than what I put on LinkedIn. It's different than what I put on TikTok or X, whatever. Like it just is.
Right.
And so if you distribute first, then create, it helps you make a lot of decisions better, and it helps you use your time better as well. And so that's why I'm like, you got to know your content pillars. You got to know where you're going, your brand voice, all that kind of stuff. You got to know where you're going to distribute, and then you decide what you're going to create.
That was such a good question. I was so glad you asked it to Rachel and not me.
Well, now I'm going to ask it to you.
Oh no. Yeah, I don't think you can have one without the other. I think if nothing else, like start with the distribution channel, and like at least you'll get feedback that way. I think, and maybe you prioritize where you can get feedback the fastest. For us in our early days, a big thing for us was going and interacting in communities. I think that's a really untapped opportunity for content marketers. We always think about channels, but there are so many now, especially like Slack communities, LinkedIn communities, whatever it may be. I think they're like what all the major asterisk on that is like, be a participant in the community. Don't just show up with your content and drop it and like expect people to engage with it. But that was a big one for us, is like, okay, we're gonna just like be a participant in a lot of like communities for marketers for as long as possible. And we're going to learn like, what are the questions they're asking? Can we help answer that question? And then when we go, and then when we provide that content in that community, we have confidence it's going to perform. But I would say like, think distribution first, and maybe prioritize where you can get feedback the fastest.
Sure.
And distribution, sorry, Nicole, but like real quick on that is like, when I think about distribution, I think of communities as a channel for distribution. And it is like, it literally is you going, where should I be? And then what literal content goes in there. So if I were to apply your strategy that you're talking about, and by the way, Cliff Simon, he did a whole thing on community-led growth that was like so good. I think he's with I always mess it up. Carbonara Group. I'm gonna butcher that.
But they were just acquired, actually.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Carbonara, though, I like that a lot.
Literally, I'm like, that's an Italian restaurant, maybe.
Yeah, I'm like, are we going for lunch after this?
Anyways, what I was gonna say with that is like, if you think about distribution first and you say, I'm going to go into community, that takes somebody's time and attention to say, I'm going to invest in these channels for a long time as a human being first.
Right.
You know what I mean? And then you knew that that could be an opportunity for you to drop, content. But specifically, it sounds like, Jonathan, you were answering questions. So that was your content strategy based on the distribution of that channel. And so that's really what I would just encourage people to do is go, where are my people? How do I engage? And then the last thing I'll say is, especially in enterprise, like you have potentially the opportunity to be a little innovative, a little disruptive in the content you create. And so sometimes it's like, I want to still scratch that creative itch with like an experiment. So I always throw wild card in there of going, I know distribution is this, I'm going to create for that channel. And then I'm like, what's the one I'm throwing spaghetti on the walls for? And that's where you get to sort of do some of that more fun out of the box thinking a lot of the time.
We've talked a lot about distribution, but I do want to think about or talk a little bit about repurposing and what that means. And so, Jonathan, I'm curious, like the trends report, and maybe if we want to keep using that as an example, or if you have another one, but how does like repurposing really fuel that distribution strategy?
Yeah, for us, what's been interesting is for that trends report. I'm happy to keep talking about that trends report. We've been talking about it for like 6 months. It keeps
We'll
working.
include it. We'll include it in the follow-up email, so you all can join along.
I think what's given that such a strong like long tail and what's allowed us to repurpose and redistribute it in a lot of different ways. It's based in data. It's based in research. And so like that real research, it's something that's not replicable right now. I think a lot of, the AI webinar is probably a separate webinar, but it can't be replicated. And so we can take those data points and they're extremely portable, right? Like we can take those to a blog post. We can take those to a podcast. We can take those to a keynote session, to a breakout session, whatever it may be. In community, we get to literally answer questions that people have about, content life cycles, gated versus ungated content. And so I think it goes to a lot of what we've been spending on this, talking about on this webinar is we've got those pillars of that report that travel well. And it's been very easy to kind of empower the team, and the team loves them. And we use them very organically, but in a lot of different places because they're backed by research.
Who do you think, especially at like a larger organization, who drives those content pillars for an entire marketing group?
Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
I'm literally like, who does do that? I mean, I always say the CEO owns the brand, right? Yeah. And so what's important to the CEO? And then from there, it would be aligning that to really the CMO at that level, who's going to carry that vision forward and then hand it over to your content team. But to me, it's a brand strategy exercise. And that, in my opinion, comes from the CEO. Yeah.
I'll maybe answer that in like a harsh way that a lot of marketers might not like, but like the sales team needs to be involved also, I think. Mm-hmm. That's the best marketing teams I've ever worked on have had a great relationship with the sales team. And I think, it's a dangerous game to just react to what sales wants or needs all the time. But I think if it's a collaborative back and forth, it will get them excited and make it that much more successful as well.
Well, that's the other thing that I've seen work really well from a sales and content creation perspective of like, if you build a cornerstone piece of content that everyone's aligned on in terms of like the positioning and things like that, and then working with sales to say, what are the assets I could give you from this that would help you be really successful? So one of the things we've done with clients before is like create sales sequences based on different personas they're targeting and things like that. And so they have buy-in on the creation process because we already know the distribution of how they're going to use it. And so having that collaborative approach, I think, is critical in today's world.
I've used this example. I think now this is maybe the third time in this series, but I think it's just such a great analogy that we forget. And it's this idea of if you have teams and the larger the company, like the more I think this is felt. But if you take your kids to the playground, Rachel, because she has 3 beautiful little ones, but if you take them and there's no fence, the amount of like room they have to go play is not going to be very far because you want to make sure you're keeping an eye on them and like keeping everything really close to the chest. But if you have a fence that is, pretty secure and you don't think they're going to hop it, like you can now sit back and say, okay, go play up to the fence. And I feel like that is marketing's job to articulate what the fence is for a business. And I think that's where you can let people have their own creativity, whether it's their personal brand or they want to post on social or they live on the social team compared to the events team, and say like, okay, if I know Jonathan, like that perspective for the business and it's articulated and that puts the fence up, now everyone can go up and kind of and even experiment, throw things on the wall as long as they know they're within the fence.
Yeah.
To me, it's like the best analogy in marketing, because that's our job, is to build the fence and empower them to know what it is, and even encourage them to go play all the way up to the fence.
Yeah, color within the lines. And then I think the like wild card idea that Rachel mentioned earlier, it's kind of like if you got the rest of the team coloring inside the lines, then the marketing team gets to go experiment with coloring outside the lines occasionally.
Yeah.
I love that. Yes. It's like, do as I say, not as I do. Marketing, you know, try new things. Okay, well, we are already close to time, and so we have about 4 minutes. But I would love to hear from each of you. Jonathan, if you want to kick us off, like, what advice would you leave to marketers in kind of this new day and age where the quote unquote playbooks may not be exactly what they expected? Like, how would you encourage them to go in, especially because we're crazy? Second half of the year is next week. Well, not, I guess not next week. You have a month to plan. You should be planning for the back half of the year. Like, what advice would you give folks, thinking about their distribution strategy?
Yeah, my perspective that we've been sharing in a lot of places is that curation is more important than creation right now. I think so many marketers get caught on this treadmill of creating content. I think if we just took some of that time and actually looked at the content we've already created, we've likely created good content. But you need to curate the right content for the right channel. So, go participate in the community, go listen to and watch the conversations on LinkedIn. You have the content. You just need to make sure you're not stuck on this new, kind of changing your perspective regularly, but take what you already have and curate it for the right people in the right channel at the right time.
Rachel?
Easy. So easy, Jonathan.
So easy.
Yeah. I would say, repurposing without distribution makes no sense. Like, what are you repurposing for if you don't know where it's going? And then to your point too, of like curation over creation, that doesn't mean you can't be creative. So
Exactly.
you might have the content that, like, maybe you have an amazing written white paper that you should be like, you know what, let's turn this into a video series. You know what I mean? Because the white paper didn't reach, or the content is still solid and great. We just want to repurpose it so that we get more eyes and ears on it. So I think that's the thing I would encourage you all with as well, is like, you don't have to kill the creative just because you're getting creative with your curation. So I would say that. And then the other thing I would also really encourage people to do is just go look at the B2B brands that are killing it consistently. And they're not necessarily doing everything that's like splashy and crazy, but I look at SparkToro. I mean, their LinkedIn posts are always driving engagement. Gong does a really nice job. And it's just like looking at it, like this is not my expertise, but Justin Simon taught me this. And it's like, look at the content without the link, look at the content without the image, look at the content and see if it stands alone. And if it can stand alone without a link to an image or a link to another thing, it's probably really good. But if you have to click the link to know what you're getting, it's probably not very good.
Wow. I'm like already, that's just like making me think and process about some of the things we've posted. I know that was kind of a wrap up, but curious in like how all of this really ties back to, like you said, Rachel, what does the CEO care about? And I think at larger enterprises, sometimes that brand awareness, the competitive moat, like that's really what you're focused on. And sometimes it is that demand gen. How do you balance, making sure you are driving towards either one of those kind of key KPIs, while also, like, to point, sometimes you're not going to have great metrics on the brand things or on the content, that if you can't capture the lead, sometimes the content to get to the really good content does suck because you're so focused on, I have to get lead gen and I have to hit these metrics. So maybe to kind of just wrap us up, I would be curious, like, how you would encourage marketers to maybe stand by their convictions of what is ultimately going to work as they think about like the brand versus demand KPIs they have to hit.
I just double down on doing fewer things better. Honestly, like, do fewer things better and everyone will be happy. We do a really good job of creating chaos for ourselves.
Yeah.
So
Jonathan?
Yeah, I think agreed. Focus is the word that comes to mind. I think the CEO has a lot of things they're worried about, some seen, some unseen. And if you can go to your CEO as the marketing leader and say, this is the one thing you should care about, and this is what you can expect to see from it, that's gonna like really like me just saying that out loud. I'm like, oh man, that would be so
literally,
nice.
my shoulders were
Yeah.
relaxed. Man, that'd be nice.
Yeah, right. So I
Well,
would say, yeah,
how to
figure out
manage
what you do and do
up
it
to a
better.
CEO is a whole other webinar that we probably should do
Yeah.
because it's a skill that not many people have, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But take it from two founders and CEOs, like they want the help. They would love the direction. They would love.
Tell me what to do.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
Awesome. Well, some great things in the chat. People really resonate with what you said. Thank you both so much for spending the Thursday afternoon with us and really closing out our webinar with some great ideas. Definitely even has me thinking about, our H2 and our strategy. So thank you both. Really appreciate the time as always.
Thanks, Nicole.
Thanks, Nicole. See you,
Awesome.
Jonathan.
All right, guys. Thank you for joining our series. It's been such an amazing journey and ride. We will send this out as well as all 5 webinars we'll package for you. We'll curate for you in an easy to play if you have any road trips this summer. But please let us know your thoughts. Please connect with Rachel and Jonathan in their LinkedIn, in the chat, and we will see you at our next webinar.